So shall we start?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So once again, a very warm morning, noon, or evening, and season's greetings to all the participants who made it to this webinar. So today's session, as part of our knowledge sharing session series, today we intend to focus on Basel III standardized approach, way to go. My name is Suresha Iyer, Executive Vice President at JMR Infotech. JMR is one of the leading technology solution provider to banks and financial institutions and provides supports in implementation of core banking solution and also risk and compliance solutions. Established in 2007, it has delivered more than 175 projects across the globe and is present in 30 plus countries in 5 continents. In association with Basel practitioners, we are conducting this knowledge sharing session to help our fellow bankers in their Basel implementation journey. I'm very happy to introduce my fellow speakers for today's session. Mr. Kannan, he comes with over 4 decades of industry experience, former chairman and managing director of Vijaya Bank, one of the leading banks in India, and currently on the boards of several companies. He is also an advisor in the risk management area. I'm also very happy to introduce our speaker, Mr. KLSN Rao, a well-known personality who comes with, again, more than 4 decades of experience. Currently, he's principal of South Indian Bankers Training College, has conducted multiple sessions on risk management, compliance, and so many other areas. He also worked for a very large government-owned bank as senior executive. And of course, his specialization is in the area of corporate lending and risk management. We are honored to have these 2 gentlemen as part of today's session. So what we thought through was, for today, we would like to focus, of course, initial 5 minutes, I will set the context, followed by we will have Mr. Kannan providing a CEO's perspective on the intricacies around standardized approach and its implication to banks, followed by our main speaker, Mr. Rao, focusing on all the aspects of Basel standardized approach. And we will be having Q&A post that. Like our other sessions, towards the end, we have allocated around 20 minutes towards Q&A. Kindly, if you have any questions, please post it on the chat box and feel free to raise in the Q&A session. So what we strongly believe is efficient risk management is one of the key things for any banker. And efficient management of risk creates opportunity, and opportunity creates value, and value creates wealth to stakeholders. If you look at the overall risk management context in alignment with the business strategy of the banks, it is interesting to see in the past, banks were focusing largely on Basel I, Basel II, and of course, in the past few years, in some other countries, banks moved towards Basel III. Or in some countries, I was pleasantly surprised to see central banks bringing in the liquidity related aspects to the Basel journey. Still, the journey is ongoing. It is not complete. And what we saw in the past was largely the entire risk management function was seen as CRO's responsibility. Compared to that today, what we are seeing is Basel III is being the preferred option, and within that, the standardized approach is one of the key approaches considered by banks across the globe. Its significance is assuming very high importance because, especially in the post-COVID era, banks which successfully migrated to Basel III, forcing the management to allocate higher capital, not only quantitative, even qualitative capital, are able to absorb the shocks in a much, much better way. Against this backdrop, what we are seeing today is the BCBS guiding the entire banking industry to move towards what we popularly call as Basel IV. The idea is the reforms, together with earlier publications and revised calculations of RWAs as outlined by BCBS, including the updated market risk framework published in January 16, are collectively today is being referred to as Basel IV by the industry. And more so, the importance of standardized approach has gained huge importance. Today, the entire risk management framework is not just CRO's agenda. It is the board's agenda, and it is everyone's responsibility. Next slide, please. So with this brief overview of the context, I would like to pass on to Mr. Kannan, who will be providing a CEO's perspective on the standardized approach and how it is impacting the banking industry. Mr. Kannan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Suresha, for setting the context right for this webinar. And greetings to all my banker friends from across the globe. Now we are talking about Basel IV. But then, why is this focus on credit risk? And why is BAS overemphasizing on the credit risk calculations? Now, the importance of today's topic cannot be explained any clearer than actually the introductory statements by BAS itself. I am referring to the December 2017 document finalizing the post-crisis reforms, that is Basel IV. I am sure all my CRO friends have definitely gone through this because that's the Bible on which we actually work. But I would like to take the liberty of reading one or two points for reference over here. Actually, I am quoting from there. A key objective of this revision in this document is to reduce excessive variability of risk-weighted assets. At the peak of global financial crisis, a wide range of shareholders, including academics, analysts, and market participants, lost faith in banks' reported risk-weighted capital ratios. The committee's own empirical analysis highlighted a worrying degree of variability in the calculation of RWA by banks. Now, this is a statement coming from BIS itself. Now, again, a prudent and credible calculation of RWAs is an integral element of risk-weighted capital framework. Banks' reported risk-weighted capital ratios should be sufficiently transparent and comparable to permit stakeholders to assess their risk profile, unquote. Now, we understand, no wonder that Basel IV is now concentrating more on the denominator of the capital ratio. For example, a simple glance at the summary will reveal that the following have undergone significant changes, or what they have termed it as improvements. Whether it is exposure to banks, exposure to corporates, residential real estate exposure, retail exposure, exposure to commercial real estate, exposure to off-balance sheet items. Last but not the least, not to forget the introduction of exposure to covered bonds, exposure to project finance, object and commodities finance. In simple words, every bank which is present over here, its entire portfolio is now to be revisited for capital calculation and for capital allocation in future. Again, my friends, there is a misconception that Basel IV is only an improvement over Basel III rules and nothing more than that. Probably an upgradation of the software will take care of all the problems. Not true. But friends, let me tell you that some of the guidelines even call for organizational change in the banks in the risk management department. For example, let us look at the standardized approach for CVA. What does the document say? The standardized approach for CVA, that is SACVA, is an adaptation of the standardized approach for market risk, that is SATB, under the revised market risk standards. The SACVA must be calculated and reported to the supervisors at the same monthly frequency as that of SATB. In addition, banks using SACVA must calculate and have the ability to produce to their supervisors the calculations on demand. Not only that, a bank must have a CVA desk or a similar dedicated function responsible for the risk management and hedging of CVA. Now we understand it is not going to be an upgradation of the software for compliance, but a thorough business process re-engineering that is needed. So we thought it fit at BPPL to bring in the experts to demystify the guidelines so that you can chart out the roadmap for your own organization. Not to forget that this is a general presentation and discussions for bankers across the globe. But if you have any organizational specific questions or hurdles which you foresee, you are welcome to visit BPPL website for a customized suggestion also. Now, let me take the pleasure of inviting the expert. We have with us today Mr. KLSN Rao, who has over 3 decades of experience having worked in one of the largest commercial banks in India at several verticals. He is an expert on credit, policy formulation, and Basel guidelines implementation. Currently, he is the principal of the Southern India Bankers Staff Training College, training over 23 bankers in implementation, not only Basel guidelines, in policy formulation also. We thought it fit that he will be the right person to talk about standardized approach, the way going forward. Now I will pass it on to Mr. KLSN Rao for the session. Mr. Rao, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Suresha, and thank you, Mr. Kannan, sir. And thanks, BPPL, for providing me an opportunity to make a presentation on the specific topic, credit risk standardized approach. In fact, the basic framework of the changes in Basel guidelines have been covered by previous speakers, Madam Shashikala and other panelists on 18/7/2021. And also, Kannan sir has briefly touched about why the standardized approach is being adopted by the banking system across the world. So a strong foundation has been laid for me to carry on. So I am thankful to all the gentlemen and Madam Shashikala for continuing my presentation. Now the question is, why standardized approach? Of course, briefly touched by Sri Kannan sir. Let me also tell you, credit risk accounts for the bulk of most banks' risk-taking activities. These are some of the terminologies which I have taken from BCBS guidelines itself. Now, standardized approach is used by majority of the banks across the world, including in the countries which have not adopted or non-jurisdictional, non-Basel jurisdictions, and also on account of certain deficiencies or the shortcomings that have been observed in the uh, IRB approach. For those reasons, now BCBS in 2017 has come back, or rather has said that banks need to adopt standardized approach and imposed restrictions or constraints on IRB approaches. Now, question is, what are the shortcomings in the IRB model? For some of the points have been clarified by Sri Kannan sir. Let me also tell you specifically. One is excess variability in risk weights across banking, as uniformity among the banks were missing. Second one, excessive complexity of the IRB approaches. And third point, not all credit risk exposures can be modeled reliably or consistently. Then fourth point which have been observed by BCBS was lack of comparability in banks' IRB capital computation. And the fifth one, lack of robustness in modeling certain asset classes. And the sixth one, model updation encompassing prevailing economic trend was found lacking. And last point was inconsistency in rating with subjectivity on certain parameters. On account of these issues, which were observed by BCBS, so in 2017, they said that to adopt standardized approach and to impose restrictions or constraints on IRB approaches. Now, the revision to the regulatory framework will help restore credibility on the calculation of risk-weighted assets by enhancing the robustness and risk sensitivity of the standardized approaches, and also for, of course, operational risk, constraining the use of IRB approach. And third point is complementing the risk-weighted capital ratio with a finalized leverage ratio and a revised and robust capital floor. So the modifications to the Basel guidelines since 2010, as Suresha was mentioning, it's a journey and improvement is a constant thing. And since 2010, what are all the modifications that have been effected in Basel guidelines, including the ones of December 2017, which we familiarly call it as Basel IV, have been stated in this slide, particularly the boxes which are in the purple color are the ones where changes have been affected. More of it would follow during my deliberations. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now here we are seeing the journey of Basel from 1 to Basel 4. Again, as can be seen, more focus and granularity was brought in to manage credit risk over a period of time. We know, and I have told you already, that credit risk constitute the major risk in the banking system, and therefore more of granularity, more of focus was brought in over a period of time in the credit risk management, and in a most scientific and manner to manage all kinds of risk relating to the credit. Now, revision in the standardized approach, what all things have been done, I intend to share with you. One is, as has been explained in the earlier slides about the need to shift back to standardized approach, the 9 high-level processes are identified as key drivers for implementation of Basel reforms of 2017 through standardized approach. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Here you can see the 9 high-level processes are identified as key drivers for implementation of Basel IV, as was discussed earlier. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, we are seeing that the purple ones are the ones where the changes have been effected. With regard to sovereign, no change in the risk weight, but for risk weighting purposes, country risk scores assigned by export credit agencies to be factored in. With regard to PSEs, there are no change. With regard to multilateral development bank, there are no change. With regard to banks, yes. Introduction of covered bonds. What are covered bonds? Covered bonds are bonds issued by a bank or a mortgage institution that are subject by law to special public supervision designed to protect the bondholders. Now here, the risk weight is based on quality of underlying pool of assets. This is covered bonds. The risk weight is based on quality of the underlying pool of assets. Like if the underlying assets are mortgage of real estate, then based on LTV concept, the risk weighting on exposures are done with regard to banks. Now, the security firms and other financial institutions, there are no changes. But with regard to corporates, yes, changes in risk weighting with more granularity, and also in respect of corporates which are not rated, or in respect of jurisdictions where the corporates are not subjected to rating, a further granularity by bifurcating the corporate exposure into investment grade and other than investment grade, corporate SME, corporate specialized lending, etc. And with regard to that, as we go along, we are going deep into each of these items, but I am just giving you a flavor of what the changes that have been made, that have been brought about in December 2017 document. Retail, yes, changes in risk weighting, introduction of transactors and non-transactors, as also retail SME. Transactor means where it's a like overdraft account where regular transactions are there in the retail account. Non-transactors are like term loan, or it can be no, there are no regular transactions in that. Then other exposures, no change. Defaulted exposures, off balance sheeted exposures, no change. Yeah, next slide, please. Now here we are seeing in the purple ECRA, that is, this is relating to the bank exposure, external credit risk assessment approach. This is applicable for banks incorporated in jurisdictions that allows use of external ratings for regulatory purposes. It applies to all their exposures to banks that are rated. Risk weight is based on the ratings provided by the rating agency, that is ECRA. Now, SCRA, Standardized Credit Risk Assessment Approach. This is applicable for all the exposure of banks incorporated in jurisdictions that do not allow use of external rating for regulatory purposes. SCRA also applies to banks incorporated in jurisdictions that allow use of external ratings for regulatory purposes. Now, here corporates are categorized under general corporate exposures and number two, specialized lending exposures. I have told you a deeper granularity has been brought in. General corporate exposures in jurisdiction that allow use of external ratings for regulatory purposes. Now, banks to assign risk weights as per the risk weightings provided by the regulators based on the ratings, like from 20% to 150%, so on. And unrated corporate exposure will have 100% risk weight, and unrated corporate exposure will have 85% risk weight. These are some of the changes which have been brought in corporate. This support general corporates in jurisdictions that do not use external ratings, in which case exposures to be classified as investment grade and non-investment grade. Investment grade, these are all in the countries which do not allow external rating. The national supervisor may not have allowed. When you classify an exposure as investment grade, risk weight is 65%. Non-investment grade, risk weight is 100%. And again, in specialized lending, the corporate exposures have been bifurcated into project finance, object finance, and commodities finance. Of course, these slides would come subsequently, but I am just giving you a flavor of it. I will not repeat whatever that I say here in a subsequent slide. I am just going through the sequence. So, risk weights varies between project finance to object finance to commodities finance. Now, in jurisdictions allowing external ratings, risk weight will be as applicable to corporates. For jurisdictions which do not accept external ratings and those exposures which do not have external ratings, the risk weight will be, see, object and commodity financing will have 100% risk weight. Project finance, pre-operational phase, it will carry a risk weight of 130%. And during the operational phase of project finance, it will carry 80%. This is how more project granularity has been brought in even in the case of corporate exposure. Earlier, all corporates were grouped based on the rating. Unrated, we know it was 100%, and like that. So therefore, these are some of the changes that have been brought. And with regard to residential real estate exposure also, instead of a flat risk weight being allocated to the residential real estate or even commercial real estate, now it is linked to the LTV. LTV, as we know, loan to value ratio. So it is linked to LTV. And commercial real estate, LTV less than or equal to 60%, risk weight is 60%, and LTV above 60%, risk weight of the counterparty. See how now aligning the risk weight more with the counterparty so that all factors are factored in to arrive at the correct risk weight of the credit exposure to commercial real estate and real estate. Now, with regard to retail SME and retail exposure, again I have told you, corporates have been bifurcated also. A further granularity has been brought in corporate with regard to corporate exposure to SME and non-unrated corporate SME. Rated corporate exposure, risk weight as applicable to corporate, we know. Unrated corporate SME, risk weight is 85%. Regular corporate, we know it is 100%. Now it is 85%. Bifurcation or classification that has been brought in retail, regulated retail is transactors. As I said, transactor is a regular overdraft kind of a facility under retail where the risk weight is 45%. Now, which exposures which do not meet all conditionalities of retail, that is granularity, etc., etc. So the risk weight is 100%. So therefore, next, therefore, friends, very important to understand the granularity that has been brought about in the risk weighting of various asset classes, which I have discussed in the last few minutes, and how it is to be done. Again, very clearly under the standardized approach, though external rating is accepted in jurisdiction, but Basel guideline has made it very clear banks need to adopt due diligence in respect of individual exposure. What it says is banks must perform due diligence to ensure that they have an adequate understanding at origination and thereafter on a regular basis, at least annually, of the risk profile and characteristics of their counterparties. I am reading from the Basel guidelines. This presentation is also there before you. I am just coming to all this in specific sequencing. In cases where both external and internal are used, due diligence is necessary to the risk of the exposure for risk management purposes and whether the risk weight applied is appropriate and prudent. It is the responsibility of the banker. The sophistication of the due diligence should be appropriate to the size and complexity of the bank's activities. Banks must take reasonable and adequate steps to assess the operating and financial performance levels and trends through internal credit analysis and or other analytics outsourced to a third party as appropriate for each counterparty. So, banks must be able to access information about their counterparties on a regular basis to complete the due diligence analysis. Next slide, please. For computation of exposure at default, with regard to OTC derivatives, standardized approach for counterparty credit risk is evolved. That is again a change that has been brought. Now, SACCR is a new computational method for exposure at default under Basel Capital Adequacy Framework, which would replace both current exposure method and the standardized method. It aims to address weaknesses in margining recognition, sensitivity, simplicity, and uniformity across national authorities. As we know, exposure at default is equal to alpha into replacement cost plus potential future exposure. This is done with a view to align market risk and default risk arising out of market risk as well. That means alignment is attempted between market and credit risk so as to make a proper projection of the credit risk. Slide number 5, please. These are commercial real estate. Friends, I have already covered commercial real estate and also covered about general real estate, then segmenting the real estate exposure, then LTV backed, etc. I have already covered. Yeah. Now, retail exposure, I have covered about transactors and non-transactors, and also corporate specialized lending classes, project finance, object finance, commodities finance. Project finance is predominantly SPV-oriented lending, which are infrastructure of project financing, where the cash flows determine the repayment to a loan. Object finance is regular financing of term loan or a working capital for the various kinds of activities. And similarly, commodities financing. Now, again, I have explained to you about the investment grade, the non-investment grade, and the corporate SME class. Also, I have told you about the risk weight for that. Next slide, please. Now, I have covered about due diligence process on that. And then here in the next slide, we are seeing that the general process of credit risk mitigation remains the same. This is a risk mitigant. There are no changes in that. However, the changes in the risk weighting of issues and guarantors and collaterals will be having a cascading impact on the credit risk management or risk mitigation. Now, optimal credit risk mitigation is the key for achieving the capital benefits, which needs not only the proper data, but also a precise technological solution. Next slide. Yeah. Now here, as we have seen, no changes. The same methodologies have been adopted for computation of credit risk, and the changes in the risk weighting, how it is to be done based on the granularity, etc., have been covered. And ultimately, exposure at default, pre-mitigation, then with the mitigation, both post-mitigation and the uncovered portion of the credit risk mitigation, and ultimately arrive at the proper risk-weighted assets for the purposes of computation of the risk-weighted assets. Next slide, please. Yeah, friends, in a nutshell, let me tell you, on account of certain inadequacies in the IRB approaches, which has been the BCBS, standardized approach is again being adopted with changes, with modifications, and bringing in more granularity in approaches, which for the last 15 to 20 minutes, I have in a nutshell given a complete input about this. But let me also tell you, the Basel reforms of December 2017, how it would impact the banking. Now, Some of these points which I have taken from the BCBS guidelines itself, I intend to narrate. One is the revised framework is expected to mainly impact the larger globally active banks in particular. Potential reduction in banks' ability to price and manage risk according to a detailed analysis of the credit risk profile of their borrower based on IRB approaches. It may lead to unwanted herd behavior of maximizing risk per unit of capital by shifting from IRB to standardized approach. Banks with high degree of exposure to residential mortgage loans shifting from IRB to standardized approach may result in higher risk-weighted asset and resultant capital charge. Again, under output floor, the increased RWA may pull down the CET ratio, leading to cost escalations for capital acquisition or formation. Beyond the quantitative impact, it is expected that Basel IV changes will force banks to re-examine the distribution of exposures across types of credit and set out of the data and systems. Some banks may look to reprice risk and gradually rebalance their portfolio composition, particularly since the increased sensitivity of risk weights under the new standardized approach would have impacts for both standardized approach for banks as well as those which may permitted to be used the IRB approach. And again, on controls and governance, the impact would be there. Also, the data and systems. What data and systems, what has been in vogue for last several years, now it may have to undergo changes on account of the detailed granularity that has been brought. Now, in summary, I can just give you the key guidelines is that enhance risk sensitivity while keeping it simple. This is what the key guidelines of Basel IV. More granular, non-rating based approaches for risk weighting, reduce reliance on external credit ratings, require banks to conduct sufficient due diligence, which I have stated already, and I have explained to you about the impact of due diligence. Again, in due diligence, if the banks find that what rating that have been acquired from the external rating, if it is slightly high based on their internal assessment, they need to pull down the rating or rather increase the rating by one notch. In conclusion, effectively, all banks need the following. They need to have a new policy and procedure with robust due diligence process, which has to be put in place for all banks where ECRA is adopted for banks exposure. New data points will have to be created for granular risk weighting. Technological upgradation is a necessity suiting to the emerging requirements, as also new reporting requirements. And next slide, please. Next step is it is for the banks to conduct portfolio impact assessment, and based on this, there will be a need for rebalancing the portfolio and repricing the product, some of which I have already dealt with. Define the required policies and procedures suiting to the emerging requirement. Very importantly, build in data gap analysis, which should further lead to technology upgrade. On the whole, friends, movement from Basel III to Basel IV is a challenging one for the banking system, for segregating each asset class into different grades depending upon the inherent characteristics. And also many guidelines can also be subjective, like for example, defining a corporate exposure as an investment grade or not. Again, due diligence also. So there is a huge challenge to the banks for doing this. but surely considering the benefits that are available by adopting to the newer technologies, by adopting to the newer versions of Basel, definitely banks will be capable of meeting or facing any kinds of challenges that may emerge in days or years ahead. As Sri Suresha was mentioning, that global financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9, which has led to collapse of lot of banks, both in US and many other countries. First financial crisis led to economic crisis, which created problems to majority of the banks across the globe. Whereas the COVID-19 situation, which has economically impacted most of the countries of the world, but one silver lining is that banks have not been impacted. Of course, one of the reasons could also be on account of the support by the government through restructuring, etc., etc., 10 to 20% of the GDP. But nonetheless, it is on account of collective effort arising from Basel plus the government guidelines. Banks have remained strong and they continue to perform their activities supporting the economic development. So, friends, with this, thank you all for hearing me patiently. And I would conclude my talk by saying that good luck to all of you. And we are with you in the journey of improving the banking system. Thank you very much. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to conclude, move forward, please. Next slide, please. Sorry for that. Yeah, so we had a very interesting session. As all of you know, this is a huge subject which requires perhaps, a person like Mr. KLS and Rao can speak for a couple of days to cover the entire, nuts and bolts of Basel III standardized approach and Basel IV, how it is impacting. So as part of my concluding remark, I would like to touch upon two very interesting things pointed out by earlier speakers. Mr. Kannan very rightly mentioned, so whatever things that are evolving today, it is not just tinkering of some policy process. So it amounts to revisiting your policy process and also, upgrading your technology tools to align with the newer requirements. Mr. Rao very rightly mentioned that today there is a huge amount of increase in the sensitivities brought forth by the Basel IV. In the next couple of years, I think our fellow bankers need to be geared up to adopt to these sensitivities, modify their policies and processes, bring in new energy to the entire risk management framework, and very importantly, have the right technology that can support them in meeting the newer challenges they are likely to see. Next slide, please. So with these few words, let me thank each one of you for gracing this session. On behalf of JMR and BPPL, I'd like to thank each one of you for making this program a grand success. We are delighted to host this knowledge sharing session over the next few months so as to enrich whatever key aspects which we feel which we have come across in the past few days. And this second session, we focused on standardized approach. We felt in the next session, we should focus a little bit on the compliance. So the plan is to focus on leveraging technology to meet compliance goals. There were a few suggestions from some of our friends that why not this session be on a weekday. So we thought this next fortnightly session, let us move to Thursday, 12th August, 5 p.m. IST, which would be 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And it will be a working day. Maybe, some of you would be able to take an hour off and attend to this session. If you have any other suggestions, please feel free to
let us know. And we are always reachable on any of these two email IDs, support@baselpractitioners.com or risksolutions@jmrinfotech.com. Thanks once again. Now we will open Q&A session. There were quite a few questions. Srini or anyone would like to react to some of the important questions that came on the chat window?
So my question was, see, the very purpose of going for an advanced approaches in the past is to encourage banks to be more risk sensitive at individual exposure level than being risk sensitive at the portfolio based approach. So banks have already spent enough amount, more amounts in getting their risk infrastructure upgraded to be able to move to these advanced approaches. Now with the standardized approach being pushed, I know it is addressing some of the issues, regulatory concerns, but now what will happen to the push to these banks which were encouraged to move to the advanced approaches? So is it not tantamounts to penalizing for being efficient?
Okay. So, Kumar, maybe let me take that question. So, if you really understand the Basel IV, what they're saying is they're actually increasing the sensitivity of standardized approach. So, earlier the standardized approach is what is that at asset class level. Now they have gone, I think, into the sub-asset class level. Means even the unrated exposures, we are supposed to actually grade them into multiple things. For example, if you look at the corporate exposure, they are saying whether it is investment grade or non-investment grade. If you look at the banking exposures, they're asking grade A, B, C. So the holistically what they're doing is they're actually improving the sensitivity of standardized approach, wherein you need to leverage all the investment which you already made for the IRB approach. And in IRB approach, they are putting restrictions in only those asset classes where the complexity is too much and the model is not in a position to actually capture the risk. So maybe I think the nomenclature is, it appears that they are focusing more on standardized, but what we need to understand is the sensitivity of standardized approach itself has been enhanced significantly, which you need to, which actually requires all the data what you are using for IRB currently. That's how I think we need to see.
Can I ask a follow-up question on this?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Is it with Basel IV, is it possible for banks to do a parallel runs for a particular one portfolio using standardized approach, and for other portfolios the advanced approaches? Are they allowed to do that parallel reporting based on the portfolios they have?
They are doing it, but I think because of the output floor concept, because now they're saying, I think they brought in the output floor concept. I think maximum is the 72.5% of whatever is the standardized. Only means I think you can actually adopting the IRB approach. Some portfolios you can actually do the standardized approach, but because of the output floor concept, it doesn't actually add much value.
Srini, can
Yes,
I
sir.
interrupt?
Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Kumar, see, the point what you have raised is either parallelly we can report on standardized, some portfolio on standardized approach and some portfolio on IRB. Primarily, I mean the Basel Accord doesn't permit that. Provided your regulator, as Mr. Srini has clarified, that in some asset classes, you can adopt IRB approach. You can approach standardized approach even if you have gone into IRB. And the restriction in Basel IV revised approach, whatever has been introduced, is related to the IRB advanced approach, and that restriction applies only on the exposures having revenue of more than 500 million euro. So for rest of the classes, you are still permitted to use IRB advanced approaches. And furthermore, in FIRB approach, which is permitted for all the exposures, you have the issues of LGD only. PD you have to internally estimate in any case. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
We have one more question from Narayan Krishnan. So he is asking about the due diligence and the importance and differentiation between ECRA and SCRA. Maybe let me clarify clearly. SCRA is one where the jurisdiction is not advocating any external ratings. And ECRA is where regulator is actually allowing you to go ahead with the external ratings. The due diligence is definitely required for ECRA, not for SCRA. That is the first thing. Okay, means due diligence is actually, it is a thing validating whether the external credit rating agency are actually assessing the risk rightly or not. So that I think clarification we need to have. Due diligence is only applicable for ECRA, not for SCRA. Okay, and due diligence is only, I think, to reduce the reliance on external credit rating agencies, though the jurisdiction is actually allowing you to adopt the external credit ratings.
Correction. Srini, correction.
Yes.
This
Yes,
due diligence is also required in project finance industry.
yes.
Even you are, I mean, when you are doing this project finance, in a way, slight, I mean, this is what the new guidelines have introduced. The same approach, what is applicable for SCRA, and on the project finance also, you have to have the due diligence process.
Yes, sir. Narayana, does that clarifies your question, or you have any follow-up question on that? You can unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. It helps, but I just wanted to understand from one perspective. I do understand that ECRA, the due diligence is only for those where the jurisdictions is asking for ECRA. But what I understood from the due diligence aspect is the numbers, whatever the ECRA is trying to give, it at most should match to the SCRA aspects. That's why the due diligence is bring into picture to avoid the variation between ECRA and SCRA. So in the presentation, Mr. Rao, he had also mentioned that the weighted asset should be like, in order to, the bank should go in a safer aspect. The weighted aspect should be one notch above the base weight that the SCRA approach would give. So I do see that what I was trying to understand was like there will be still variations between whatever results that the ECRA would give. So how should those banks or jurisdictions with ECRA handle these sort of variations? Please clarify.
So the due diligence maybe just look at like, go ahead, sir.
Kumaran, sir. Hello. Oh, okay.
Okay, so regarding the, what is that, Narayanan, how do we see is due diligence is, I think bank need to assess its own risk on every account, right? Means more reliance on external credit rating agency is being discouraged. That's how you look at it. External credit rating agencies, based on that, you can actually assess the base risk weight, but you need to actually validate the base risk weight, which is derived based on the external credit rating agency, is right or wrong. Every bank need to actually go and check that. And during that process, it should not give any favorable treatment. That's what they are saying. Finally, they are asking the banks also need to, don't rely too much on the external credit rating agencies. You need to keep validating that. That is the principle what they have brought in as a part of the.
That is right. But also, what you said is perfectly right. But also, fact of the matter is, if the external rating has clipped in properly assessing, at least banks with the internal transactions that is available to them, as also the complete details of the accounts with them, So they need to analyze whether what rating has been given duly that corporate deserves that or not. So as he was mentioning, in such cases where there is a difference in the assessment made by the bank based on their analysis, as also the rating awarded by the external rating agency, if there is a difference, one notch up should be the one. That is what Basel committee has suggested. That is what I also feel like that.
Yes, sir.
Sir, one more question. In the past, Basel guidelines were not very consistent on treating specific provisions in calculating exposure at default. So few countries were allowing the specific provision to be reduced from the EAD, and few countries, of course, it is more to do with the local regulators. But any standardization has been arrived in Basel IV so that all the countries treat the specific provisions the same way?
That's a good question, Kumar. At least from my point of view, what I can say is Basel guidelines is with reference to the unexpected loss. Means I think the capital computation. IFRS guidelines gives the, I think, guidance on how to compute the provisions. And there is almost now, I think, a common understanding and a perfect integration between IFRS 9, I think, which actually gives the expected loss methodology of provision computation. And Basel uses the output of IFRS 9 while computing the unexpected loss capital.
Okay, thank you.
Basel is not giving any guidance on how to compute provision. Hope, I think, we are on the same page, right? Come on.
Yeah, thanks, sir.
Okay. Srini, there is a question from Radhika.
I mean, that is very interesting.
Yes, yes. If banks themselves validate the ratings provided by ECRA, is it not that a conflict of interest? No,
Yes.
it is not.
Okay.
No. Srini,
Yes.
let me respond to this, please.
Yes.
See, in a way, I agree with Radhika. Yes, it is likely to have some kind of conflict with the rating agencies. But this is for banks, they have to put in place a robust system where they can have their own internal assessment and they can subsequently validate that assessment. So, prima facie, yes, it is likely to have some conflict of interest, and only time will resolve that kind of thing. That is my opinion. Srini, you can go ahead, please.
No, that's perfectly right, sir. Only one thing is based on the internal assessment, means based on the due diligence, you cannot pass on any favorable risk weight treatment. That's why I think they are saying only notch up is permitted, not notch down. So that rider they brought in. You are just validating. And if you feel, I think it actually attracts more risk weight, you need to give it. But if you feel that what is the risk of that particular exposure is less than due diligence. Radhika, do you have any follow-up question, or does that satisfy? Okay.
I think Srinivas, one of the interesting things I
any
see
further?
is, one of the interesting things I'm seeing is some amount of interaction between IFRS and Basel. Maybe, as part of this knowledge sharing session series, for the benefit of our participants, we'll plan something on that as well, and we will announce the same in due course.
Sure, sir.
So if there are no other questions, I think, once again, we'll thank all the participants for joining this session. And we look forward to see you all on 12th, Thursday, August 12th at 5 p.m. Indian time. We will be sharing with you the invite and link everything in the next couple of days. Have a wonderful day, wonderful evening, and let's be in touch and give us an opportunity to help you if you have any specific questions. Feel free to write to us. Have a great day and bye for now.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a
Thank
very
you.
insightful
Thank
session.
you all.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.